All right, Kara, your interview comes at a time when Klobuchar, she is facing some scathing criticism surrounding how she treats her staff. The Atlantic put out a headline this week, "The Anger of Amy Klobuchar." It goes on to say, quote, "The senator has mostly not disputed the specifics, instead seeking to frame the behavior as part of the high expectations she has of herself and her staff." What do you make of this explanation? Until now, I've often said, would we be asking these same questions if it was a strong, smart, tough man?
Well, I think definitely women who are tough bosses, or in this case, some of the stories are pretty bad, do get a harder time than men do. But the fact of the matter is, it's still not a good boss. I still at the very bottom. And so I do want to talk to her about that, about what it means. And we can talk about the sexism all you want, but there's a lot of just plain old criticisms. And I think no matter the gender, people should face those questions, especially if she's running for president. And so I will be asking her about that. I don't want to dwell on it too much, especially the sort of weirder aspects like the comb salad eating thing. I think that can get overplayed too much. I'm more interested in what that means for what she's going to do, and I'm interested in policies like around tech. She opened when she announced about issues around tech. She's been very out front compared to a lot of other politicians on the idea of regulating big tech. So I'm going to ask her about that. I do want to ask her about the dropouts in the campaign of like Sherrod Brown and others. And obviously I'll ask her about Trump and how she's going to face him and what's the way she wants to do that. So she's running for president, so she should face, pretty tough questions.
Stay on the big tech thing with me for a moment. She said in that announcement speech, when it comes to digital privacy, we've got your back. What does she mean by that? And is it a big priority for voters? We know it should be, but if you actually look at Facebook, we looked at all the wrongdoing of Facebook over the last year, and still they haven't taken a big hit in user growth.
Well, not yet. Look at what Mark Zuckerberg announced yesterday. He wouldn't announce that. He's got a money-making machine, and he wouldn't start suddenly pivoting into becoming Snapchat if he thought things were going really well. I have a column about to come out in the New York Times talking about why I think he did that. But no, I think regulatory issues are important no matter if voters want to deal with them or not. It's obviously not the sexiest campaign issue, but at the same time, it's critically important to think about how you want to regulate big tech. At the same time, keep up innovation, keep up startup growth, the stuff that really does create jobs in this country. And I think, I'm here at South by Southwest. Besides eating barbecue, there's all kinds of startups and things like that that we talk about. And the innovation growth has been very slow in this country. Startup growth has been very slow in this country over the past few years. So how do we keep that going and at the same time deal with these massive companies that have untold power and untold money and are really dampening innovation?
Yeah, because they control it all. All right, the New York Times is reporting that another 2020 hopeful, Elizabeth Warren, she's going to propose a new plan to take on tech. And they said this, quote, "The proposal calls for the appointment of regulators who will unwind tech mergers that stifle competition and that would force the rollback of some acquisitions by tech giants like Facebook's deal with WhatsApp and Instagram and Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods." What's your take on that? I mean, we know Elizabeth Warren, she's never met a regulation she doesn't like, but this one, is this going to make sense?
Well, they're not going to roll back anything. That's not going to happen. Like, come on. That's not. But I think it's going to question what they can buy in the future and things like that. And I think, she's shooting like that's her first play here is to be very aggressive. And I think that's smart for her and other people. Like, there's many politicians who are going for the harder stance. And then we'll see what we should do. I think the question is, how much should these companies should be regulated? And at the very bottom, they have to have significant privacy regulation with teeth in it. That's the very first step. And then the question of what they're allowed to buy, what data they're allowed to trade, and how they should be behaving as corporate citizens. I think Microsoft underwent antitrust scrutiny. I'm guessing a lot of these others companies will the same going forward. And I think antitrust is actually the way a lot of this stuff is going to work out rather than legislation. But at the very least, privacy legislation is critically important.
All right, Kara, thank you so much. Kara, down in Austin, Texas for South by Southwest. Maria Teresa, Peggy still with me. Here we are. We've got Amy Klobuchar speaking, Elizabeth Warren. I know Howard Schultz is going to be giving his speech. What's the most important message, the unifying message? And do they want to have a unifying message?
Well, right now it's a big scrum of a lot of people. How many are declared? 12 or 13? And how many are kind of waiting, teeing up? I think what each of the candidates at South by Southwest and otherwise is trying to do is distinguish herself, distinguish himself. I'm different from the pack. I stand for things that you believe are needed right now. And distinguishing yourself is what you do 18 months out.
But in terms of distinguishing yourself is one of the issues that the Democratic Party is so divided. We hear them say our priority is to defeat President Trump. But you've got very different ideologies under that tent, which is why Howard Schultz is saying he can't fit there.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting, though. The Democrats, it's for them to lose, I think, in many ways. I think you have the majority of the American people that are actually very much aligned with what they're seeing coming out of the administration, and it's not sitting well with them. The
Trump's
challenge,
approval ratings up.
in certain sectors, yes, absolutely. But the interesting part is that you have, at the same time, you have these individuals battling out the ideas for the Democratic Party within the tent. People's concern with Howard Schultz is that he basically, in order for him to win and increase his approval ratings, is basically to diss the Democratic Party and any platform that comes out of it, and that makes Donald Trump stronger. So, as an analyst, is the more the Democrats actually battle upon ideas, and the best person that comes up with that litany of ideas that wins the hearts and minds, that's what's going to make them stronger. What has not happened in either party in a long time has been a battle of ideas of what we're going to do to move the country forward. And most of the American people, they are seeking big, audacious plans. And the person who can come up and think of big, audacious plans wins. The fact that Elizabeth Warren is at South by Southwest, which is more than anything a technology conference, and saying, look, you need to be regulated by Facebook and Google, that all of a sudden says, wait a second, I'm not afraid of you, and I'm going to have the backs of the American people. It's curious.
Who's Donald Trump most afraid of running against?
I don't know. Who has he been tweeting about most?
I would say Beto. And the reason he's afraid of Beto is that there are different ports of entry across the border. Why did he choose to go to Beto? Because he's like, I'm going to try El Paso.
Hometown.
Exactly right.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.